In this Hauseit tutorial, we're going to walk you through how to use the co-op flip tax calculator available at Hauseit.com. If you're not already on the calculator page, you can get here by visiting Hauseit.com and look for the calculators button towards the top. Navigate to the Sell button and click on Co-op Flip Tax Calculator. The purpose of the calculator is to help estimate, as a prospective seller in the city, what your flip tax may be that is payable at closing. Now, it's worth mentioning that the flip tax itself can actually be something which both condominiums and co-ops charge sellers, although on average it is highly unlikely to find a condominium that does charge a flip tax. So in general, the majority of the people who are looking at this page, perhaps yourself, are thinking of selling a co-op or possibly thinking of buying a co-op and trying to understand the long-term implications and potential future closing costs of selling a co-op in New York City. Typically, the flip tax itself is available for reference in possibly up to 3 locations. The most common place to find a flip tax is in the purchase application of your building. Now, whether you're in a condominium or a co-op, essentially every building in the city, give or take, will require the buyer to fill out an application and submit a series of documentation. This instruction guide, also known as the purchase application, not only lays out the things that the buyer needs to submit, but also usually indicates the associated fees for both the buyer and the seller when it comes to a transaction in the city. So that's the first place to look. You can get the purchase application by reaching out to your managing agent, and if your managing agent is on the larger side, so if you're in a mid to large size building and they have a pretty large managing agent, it is possible that they'll have a website online where you can download these documents. And even if you're the type of person who keeps meticulous records, and let's say you actually have the original purchase application from when you bought, it's still a very good idea to reach out to the managing agent to reconfirm that they haven't updated the application. It is also possible that a co-op or a condo can actually implement a new flip tax, or they can increase or lower the flip tax even after you've purchased a unit. So you really don't want to make any assumptions about a flip tax without really double checking with the managing agent. Now let's look at a couple examples of what you would actually see if you were to do some research to try to figure out what your flip tax would be. So here we're going to pull up 5 examples of what a flip tax would look like. So let's just pull that. Here we have a few examples of how to find your flip tax. So in the first example on the screen, this is actually a list of the fees payable by the seller during the actual sale process. So we can go over a couple of them here. The first one is what's called a New York State transfer tax on the number of shares that you have. Now this is a negligible fee, primarily because it's 5 cents per share. The average condo, or rather a co-op in a city, probably only has maximum a few hundred shares, so this can never be a meaningful amount of money. There is also in this case a transfer fee payable by the seller, very small fee, one-time fee, and it appears to be due at the closing. Some fees are payable upon submission of the application, even possibly for the seller, so it is worth double checking that with your listing agent. If you're already in the process of selling, you should make sure that your listing agent is all over this application from the moment you're in contract. You'll want to make sure your buyer is working expeditiously towards getting this to the finish line. And there may also be some signature pages that you as the seller need to fill out, so you want to get a head start on that the moment you're in contract. So going back to flip tax, as you can see here, there is a flip tax for 5% of the sale price. Here's another example. In this case, the flip tax is 2% of the gross sale price. So if we go back to the calculator, let's take this and try a few examples. Let's assume that the sale price is $1,250,000. And we can start with the first example and say that the flip tax is 5% of the sale price. The default option here selected is percentage of sale price, primarily because that's the most common outcome for flip tax that you'll see in the city. So as you can see, it's automatically calculated your flip tax. Now you can email the results to yourself if you'd like. You would just click here, input your email. So let's just put in a test email here. Go ahead and send. And you'll get a notification once the email has actually sent. You can also print out a PDF, save it down, share it with a friend or a family member. The other scenario we talked about was a 2% flip tax. Now obviously the flip tax will be much lower if you're fortunate enough to have a building with a lower flip tax. Now going back to our examples, we have a third example here which actually has a slightly different type of flip tax. So if you look here at the schedule of fees, again we've gotten this from the buyer's purchase application, you're going to see here that there is a flip tax of $15 per share. So in this case, going back to the calculator, you would actually remove the flip tax percentage and you would put in $15 as the flip tax per share. Now to calculate the flip tax, you would then just input the number of shares assigned to your co-op. Let's say you have 300 shares. So we'll also want to change the flip tax type to dollar per share, and here it's going to calculate the total flip tax. Now if you look at this amount relative to this sale price, you'll see that it is very small compared to a percentage flip tax. So in general, if you see a dollar per share flip tax, on average it's going to be reasonably low. Now that being said, and to reiterate, it is possible for a co-op to change its flip tax, and we're going to show you an example of how that might happen. So here is an example of a possible vote sent out by a co-op board to its shareholders. And in this case, as you can see here from the agenda item B, they are looking to propose an adoption to the amendment to the proprietary lease as well as the bylaws in order to essentially implement a transfer fee, also known as a flip tax. So in this case, they actually want to impose a flip tax in a situation where there currently is not a flip tax. It's also important to note that if this is actually implemented, they provided a date, an effective date for which any contract signed on or after that date would be held to the new flip tax. So if you're in this rare situation and a flip tax is being considered by your building, you may want to think about possibly when that would go into effect, and whether or not as a seller you'd be able to figure out a strategy which would allow you to maximize the chances of getting to a signed contract prior to that date where the new flip tax is adopted. It is also worth thinking about, as a buyer, how you would interpret a possible flip tax, how you would figure it out. Customarily, if you're looking at listings online, it usually will not state the flip tax, nor will it usually give you the ability to download any documentation surrounding the building. So customarily, the way to go around this is to ask your buyer agent, and they'll reach out to either the listing agent or the managing agent. But it's also worth considering and remembering that as a buyer, after an accepted offer, you will have an attorney conduct some due diligence on your building. And part of that due diligence report that they'll generate will usually include some sort of quick look at the flip tax. So in this case, we've actually opened up a real buyer due diligence PDF report prepared by an attorney for a prospective purchaser. And here they have actually transmitted to the buyer their determination of what the flip tax might be. So quick summary there, basically, if you're a buyer, even if you don't ask about the flip tax, a good lawyer will usually review that and tell you what it is. That's not something we're guaranteeing, and the strategy does vary by attorney, but just in general, even as you think about attorneys, you may want to ask them as a buyer, what kind of diligence are you going to do? Is there some sort of report you're going to share with me? Is there a checklist of things you're going to help research on my behalf? But your buyer agent can also help you take a look. It's also important to mention, with regard to flip taxes, that usually the contract itself will mention who is going to be responsible for the flip tax. And that's because even if a co-op's purchase application says that the seller has to pay it, such as this one, it still doesn't really mean that contractually that is the case. So any attorney on the buyer side and the seller side is going to want to really confirm as part of the contract whose responsibility it is. So you can see here, it's one of the terms of an actual contract that the seller is going to pay the flip tax. Oftentimes you will find a seller who tries to negotiate the flip tax. Usually that will only be something that happens if the market dynamics give a seller enough leverage to demand that the buyer pay something that's customarily paid by the seller. But worth remembering again that everything is negotiable, but as a buyer or a seller, when you're trying to negotiate, you do have to really step into the shoes of your counterparty. You have to think about the market realistically, detach yourself from emotions, and think about what is realistic. And once you've figured out what is realistic to ultimately end up on, you have to think of a strategy that will get you to a realistic and achievable ending point in any negotiation. So going back to the calculator, as a quick summary, 3 types of flip taxes. We've talked about 2 of them. We've talked about percentage of sale price, and we've talked about dollar per share. There is a less common flip tax, which is called percentage of profits. And in this case, usually it's a percentage flip tax, but it's based on the profits that you're taking home on the sale. Now, in order to calculate that, there's 2 components we need. Actually, there's 3. We have our sale price, we have our flip tax percentage. Now, let's say it's 5%, and let's say that it cost you $900,000 to buy the property plus $100,000 to renovate. So your so-called cost basis, the amount you've invested in the property, is $1 million. Therefore, if we're using percentage of profits, your flip tax would be calculated by taking the difference between the sale price and your cost basis, which is $250K, and multiplying that by 5%. So if we break down the math a little further here, let's say we have our $1.25 million sale price, and let's say you spent, in this case, $800,000 on the purchase, and you spent, let's say, $150,000 on renovations. So your cost basis is actually going to be the sum of any capital improvements you've made and the purchase price. So your cost basis here is $950,000. So if we go back to this example and we update the cost basis, you'll see that it automatically computes your flip tax based on a percentage of profits. So that's really how we use the calculator. One final note, if you're thinking about buying a property in the city, most people buy co-ops because of the fact that they're more affordable. They're more affordable both in terms of the actual purchase price and also because buyer closing costs are usually much lower for co-ops compared to condos. Now, the reverse is usually the case when you're selling. Namely, co-ops have higher seller closing costs than condominiums or townhouses for that matter. We've talked about the reason, and it's because most co-ops charge sellers a flip tax. So you'll want to think about that as a buyer. And how much am I saving at the beginning? How quickly am I going to sell, right? If I'm selling very quickly and I have a huge flip tax, does that make sense? Is it a better idea to perhaps buy a condominium, albeit something maybe smaller, just given the fact that they're more expensive? We hope this was helpful. We have a number of other explainer videos for our other calculators here on the Hauseit site. A couple of quick ones. We have the buyer closing calculator and a couple others related to buying the mansion tax as well as the mortgage recording tax. A ton of others here. Purchase SEMA as well. That's interesting if you're thinking of buying a condo or a house. You can save some money on your buyer closing costs by learning about that. And then for sellers, we talked about the flip tax calculator. You may also be interested in looking at the transfer tax calculator as well as the seller closing cost calculator. Good luck out there.